Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the How To Academy. My name is David Malone, and it's my pleasure this evening to talk to Owen O'Kane. He has dual medical and psychotherapy training and is a former clinical lead for an NHS mental health service, and whose previous books have been Sunday Times bestsellers. And his current book, How to Be Your Own Therapist. Owen, thanks for coming in this evening.
You're welcome. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
At the start of the book, Owen, you introduced this notion that the first and probably the most important step to becoming your own therapist is telling what you call your real story. What do you mean by the real story?
The real story. Well, you know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and one of the things you discover as a therapist when people show up for therapy initially, they'll give you a version of their story. And it's normally the kind of the more polished, rehearsed, respectable version of the story. And I think we all do that. I mean, we chat today and we say, hello, how are you doing? And we'll say, oh yeah, I'm good, I'm fine. We rarely actually be truthful and talk about how we're really doing that day. And that's just kind of habitual for most of us. And it plays into therapy as well, where people will give you the version that they think is acceptable and okay and won't shock you too much. And of course, you can't really do much with that version because that's what people are acting out from all of the time. So what I really do in the book is try and encourage people. You know, the first half of the book is like a crash course in therapy. And you've got to start off with your story, because my argument is that your story is your power. And most people don't realize that. I think most people disconnect from their stories, or they push it down, or they try to deny it or get away from it, when actually there's a lot of power in your story. But it's the ability to be able to tell it truthfully and unapologetically that enables you to then really reclaim your story and make it work for you rather than it work against you. So that's what I mean when I talk about the real story.
Do you think that people sometimes tell the Facebook story even to themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, because I mean, we know this. So you never see the real version on Facebook or Instagram. You get the glossy how you want the world to see you. It's always fun and great and exciting. We rarely see the true stories on Instagram. And I think we're kind of taught to portray that image to the world. But I also think that we then learn that, okay, well, I should sort of buy into that belief. And I should buy into the belief that things should be perfect, and I should be feeling great all of the time, and my life should be better than it is. So I think we almost kind of collude with the lie that everyone's living perfect lives. And we, of course, they're not. You know, I was laughing about this with a friend, actually. I went on to, I think it was Instagram or something on Friday night, and I'd had a really full-on day. I've been promoting the book, and I've still got clinical work and doing lots of stuff. I think I finished work about 10 o'clock. And I came in and I'd walked the dog, and I was absolutely knackered. And I went on Instagram, and it seemed like the entire world was partying and having a great time. And I momentarily looked at Instagram and thought, God, what am I doing wrong? You know, I haven't stopped. I've been up from 7 o'clock and it's 10 o'clock and I'm still working. And it was just a moment of tiredness. And I think, God, it's so easy to buy into that belief that everyone else is having a better time. It's an illusion. So I think, culturally that's got worse over the last 10 years, really, with social media culture, that, we believe that we should be playing out these lives that we see when actually, they're not real.
Yes. And a word which crops up in lots of different parts of the book is ashamed. You point out that people are sometimes ashamed of their own lives to themselves. It's like they're almost ashamed in private and ashamed to come to therapy. And I think you say you've had this experience of people being all shamefaced to even come to ask you for therapy.
Oh yeah, I mean, I get it. I mean, I get this all the time. Very often clients will say to me, can you not put therapist on the invoice? Which is a regular, it's a regular occurrence. I've had this happen a number of times, where in my office, if I have therapist on the door or my title on the door, I've had people say, do you mind not having your title on the door, because they don't want to be seen coming to a therapist office. And it was a really interesting one for me when I was doing this, the book, the latest book, How to Be Your Own Therapist. I had a real debate in my own head about, God, do I put the word therapist in the title? Will that put people off? Will it stop them coming to the book? And I thought, actually, if I don't do it, I'm kind of almost colluding with stigma, because there is nothing wrong with therapy. Therapy is the most helpful, empowering thing in the world. So I think, well, why would I keep that from people if I know that it can help? Why wouldn't I share some of the techniques with people? But I think I talk about shame a lot because I think shame for most people is at the heart of their story. And it's the one subject we talk in, certainly in mental health and psychology. I think we talk more about the symptoms. So we talk about depression, anxiety. We use the word disorder a lot, which drives me crazy because I think we're not disordered. We're human beings who struggle. That is the bottom line. But I think a lot of people have shame in their story, and they may not identify it as that. Shame is a big word. It's an uncomfortable word. When actually, I think many of us have been shamed within our upbringings and our stories. I mean, I'm an Irish Catholic, so I think, quite qualified to talk about shame. I also happen to be gay, which adds another complete layer of substance to the matter. And so I do understand shame because I was shamed a large part of my early story. So I've got a real interest on the impact of shame. But I see it in therapy all of the time. People come and they've been told they're not good enough, or they've been told they're less than, or they've been rejected, or they've experienced abandonment. And often the secondary consequence of all of that is people carry a lot of shame around with them. And so what I talk about a lot in the book is, shame doesn't survive when you bring it out into the light, when you illuminate light. And that's why, I really push hard on, do tell your story, all of the story, the darker parts, the more difficult parts, the parts that you normally keep secret and hide away. Because the more you do that, then you basically charge shame, you give it power. Where actually, when you move the other direction, you kind of disarm it and you kind of regain control. So for me, I think it's often, I'm not a huge fan of diagnosis or pathologizing people, but I think shame is often one of the areas that gets missed most in therapy. People focus on the top layer and they don't go to the heart of struggle.
Yes, I mean, right in the middle of the book, you have this wonderful line which just jumped out at me when I read it. It said, "You don't have to be a victim of your thoughts. You are not your thoughts.
Yeah,
you are free of the tyranny of your mind." There's very strong statements, and I suppose am I right in saying that you feel that often people are trapped in somehow the thoughts have become like a little, they start out as a defense maybe and become a prison?
I mean, it's in my experience therapeutically, it's one of the most dominant themes I come across. I mean, people come in and they'll talk about, what's going on for them and what they're thinking. We've got about 80,000 thoughts a day, approximately, according to neuroscientists. And of course, about 60 to 70% are quite negative, critical, judgmental in nature. They're kind of driven by fear and protective mechanisms. So, it's a lot of activity and it's a lot of negative activity, and often it's not needed because we're kind of primarily hardwired to protect and guard ourselves, often when we don't need to. But when you listen to people talking about the type of thoughts they're having, often the critical and the judgmental thoughts or the harsh internal narrative, they'll talk about it like it's factual. So they'll say stuff just off the cuff and say, well, I was just thinking how rubbish I am, or how pathetic I am, or how rubbish my life is. And then, you then begin to explore it a bit with them and say, well, where's the evidence and the facts to prove that is true? Is that a definitive truth? And then people then start to, they look at you and there's almost a moment of, well, I'm not sure, but I've always thought this way, so it must be true. And of course, the majority of what we think is just a narrative. There's a lot of irregularity in our thoughts. Often there's a randomness to a lot of our thinking. But of course, the more we engage in psychology, we call it metacognitive processing. So it's many thoughts. And of course, with the more difficult or the fearful or the anxious thoughts, what we do is we engage with them. We treat them as factual. And of course, the more we engage with them and engage with the narrative, then they build. So it's kind of almost like putting fuel in the fire. They build, and then suddenly it feels overwhelming.
Right. So you can build yourself a negative narrative and then find yourself sort of enclosed in it.
Absolutely. And of course, the human mind has a great capacity for imagination and creating stories.
Yeah.
So what starts off as, I'm just thinking of a client I worked with recently. They were worried about losing their job. It was a worry, and it was an understandable worry, but there was no evidence that it was going to happen. It was just a worry about what would happen if I lost my job. But then when I kind of get into the conversation about where that went, well, of course, it became a conversation about, I'm going to lose my home. I'm not going to be able to afford to pay my mortgage. What if I can't feed the kids? What if I end up in the streets? And these then became very real worries that then got replaced by another set of worries about those worries. So then suddenly they were completely saturated with unhelpful thinking. So it's about the ability to spot sometimes that, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with thought and thinking. Sometimes we need to process. Sometimes we need to think through a situation. But I think it's the ability to be able to spot, okay, here's my critic, or here's my judgment, or here's my catastrophizing, and see it as a pattern that you don't have to engage with. No, you can just observe it curiously, but don't over engage with it.
You also make the point that it's not enough just to tell your story to yourself, that you've got to, you say, interestingly, find someone that you can actually tell it to.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing. So why is that? Why is it not enough for me to just tell it to myself?
Because I think, it's gone back to that narrative about shame, because you just tell the story to yourself, that's fine, but you still haven't brought out into the light and into the open the truth and the reality of your story. So it's kind of almost like, well, when we keep stuff, I mean, even that language is fascinating. Why wouldn't I just keep it to myself? Because when we keep stuff to yourself, it's normally because we're ashamed of it.
Yes, keeping, that's a good point. Yeah.
So it's like, actually, no, how about not keeping it? And of course, choosing someone that you trust and that will listen and engage and not judge or interrupt, or, that is really, really important as well. Because, when your story's heard, I mean, I learned this in my own therapy. As therapists, we have to have therapy. And in my own therapy in my early 20s, I learned that, the liberation that came with telling my story truthfully, and to be able to sit in a room, because at that time, my story to me was the most awful thing that ever could be told, because I was carrying a secret. I was carrying a massive secret around my sexuality. And at that time, it was bad and it was wrong and it was disordered, and it was going to lead to rejection and shame, and my family would abandon me, all of this stuff. That was the reality. So to bring that to someone else was unimaginable. But then when I did bring it to someone else and they didn't react in the same way, and they were like, okay, that's fine, just the acceptance and being able to tell the story and someone not running away from it or judging or seeing anything wrong with the story. It was like, okay, maybe this isn't as bad as I think after all. It's that human acceptance from another person that can be life-changing for a lot of people.
But it must take an awful lot of courage or desperation or something to get to that point.
I think courage is probably the right word, but anything worthwhile in life often does take courage. And I think it is about that capacity to be able to dig deep. I mean, I don't apologize for saying this, because I think it's true. Therapy should feel uncomfortable. If you pick up this book, it's not a, you've read the book. It's not it's not a Disneyland read. It's it's not a fairy dust, look in the mirror and tell yourself you're beautiful and life is good again, or, manifest and wish for your life to change and it's all going to happen tomorrow. It is not that sort of book. There will be moments when you might read a section and feel a bit uncomfortable or might feel a bit challenged, but that is what good therapy should be. Good therapy should make you feel a bit uneasy. It should challenge you. It should, you should feel those internal rumblings of, oh God, this doesn't feel great, but that's absolutely 100% okay, because that's where the change and the development and the growth happen.
Yeah, so, I mean, I got to chapter 5 and thought, why am I not feeling better?
You're doing well.
I mean, the other thing you make a point about is that it's not enough to tell your story or to think about your story. you have to step back and say, what am I feeling
Yeah.
when I'm telling the story? Tell us what you mean by that, because that's
I
a big gear change, isn't it?
It's a big gear change. I mean, therapists, look, we talk about feelings a lot. You can't have a conversation with a therapist and leave feelings out of it. I mean, it's part of the deal, really. And but the interesting thing is, many people, myself included in my early years, are taught to disconnect from feeling unless it's positive feelings, so we're obsessed, by positive psychology. So going back to the Instagram thing, it's got to feel good. Everybody wants the positive emotions. They want to feel great. They want to feel loved. They want to feel secure. They want to feel successful. These are all very understandable. They want, people want the warm feelings. They want the warm experiences. They want the highs. But the reality is the other stuff, the darker emotions, fear, anxiety, worry, doubt, sadness, loneliness, all of those emotions have a really powerful purpose. But the key lessons most people are taught are to, push them down. They're not good. Don't talk about that. You don't want to be sad. You don't want people to see you like this. When actually all human emotions are there for a purpose. They're not accidental. And I describe them like being a signpost. If you've got a day when an emotion comes up that you're not expecting, or if you're telling your story and an emotion comes up, I'm interested in the emotion because there's probably a lot of information within the emotion.
Yes, that's what the point you make in the book is that you may say something and not even pay attention to the fact that emotionally it's done something to you. Yeah. And it's connecting those two things and saying, why is there a connection here? Well,
it's also about giving yourself permission to feel, because often we're told not to feel, put that away. In Irish culture, certainly where I grew up, there was always a thing about discounting the emotion. Oh, you're lucky compared to most people in the world. There are people starving in the world. So you weren't really allowed to have negative feelings because it was like, you're lucky. You've got a home, you've got a roof over your head, and all of that was true. But then the trying to express any sort of negative emotion and stuff then came with a retribution. Don't feel that. You're not. So, it's about giving people permission to access all of the emotions, because if you think of it almost like a computer program, to not have access to those emotions means that you miss a large part of the program.
And you won't understand why you're feeling. I mean, that's a lot of it, isn't it? Is that your help, the book is saying, try to understand why you have this feeling when you recount something.
Yeah, and even if you can't get to the why, even if you have a curiosity about the emotion, so like let's use anger, for example. I often see this if I'm working with men particularly, and it might sound like a huge generalization, but if I'm working with men generally, the anger is an emotion I can get to very, very easily with most men, because it's an acceptable emotion and it feels in line with what it is to be a bloke, to be angry. But the interesting thing about it is you then start to go to the anger and explore what that is. And 9 times out of 10, it's never really about the anger. It's almost an underlying issue around feeling sad or feeling rejected or feeling a bit lost. But because those emotions are difficult for a lot of guys to go to, it's easier to access the anger emotion because it's more acceptable. So the curiosity about the emotion is, oh, actually, you weren't really that angry at all in the moment. You were symptomatically acting out or displaying anger, but the reality is you were genuinely sad or were feeling something quite significant, but not allowing yourself to feel that. And of course, when then you give someone permission to do that, then there's a relief and a freedom and you ease burden straight away.
There's another interesting phrase you used twice in the book, sort of important junctures. You say to turn up authentically in your own life.
Yeah.
That's such a fantastic phrase. Tell us what you mean by that. And
I think, look, we see this a lot in our everyday life. I mean, it's, when probably the best way I can describe it is, sometimes we meet people, all of us meet people in our everyday lives, and almost instantaneously when we meet people who are just going through the motions, or they're painting a facade, or they're delivering the version that they think is acceptable, we feel it instantaneously as a connection with a human being. It doesn't feel real.
Yes,
We all know that.
inauthentic, you said.
Yeah,
Inauthentic,
yeah,
yes.
you just feel that sense of, this doesn't feel connected. It just feels like we're going through the motions.
Mm.
And I think very often what we do is, because most of us are carrying around other stuff, we are carrying around heavier stuff and difficult experiences and emotions that are difficult to carry sometimes. But often I think when you meet people in life who are actually comfortable with all of that, they're comfortable in their own skin, they're comfortable with who they are, they're comfortable with all of the emotions, they're comfortable with their imperfections. I can't say that how important that is. They're just comfortable being a human being, because we're a mix of everything as a human being. And I think when you meet people who are comfortable and at ease with all of that there, you immediately connect with their authenticity. And there's something incredibly charismatic and engaging and attractive about that, because there's no pretense. It's just like they are delivering who they are. And I think you can't help but be impacted with a sense of comfort and ease around them.
Mm.
I think the next time you go to a conference, or you're at a talk, or you're doing something big, I'm always really struck when someone gets up and they're delivering the professional persona or the version of them that they want portrayed in that event. You will experience it and you will hear it just as an event, and you'll absorb very little of what's happening. And then someone comes out onto the stage and they just deliver something quite raw and honest and real, and the entire room set up, because authenticity has moved in. And it's hard to describe, and it's hard to give a detailed, descriptor of what that is, but when you're around it. And I think it's about truth telling. There was that brilliant piece of research that the American, so I think she was a social worker by background, Brené Brown, who did that powerful TED talk. And she talked about, she did 12 years of research, and she explored about, who are the people who are happy, who are the people who seem to be doing pretty okay. And after 12, 13 years of research, she came up that people who could be okay with their own vulnerability and weaknesses, they were the people who were genuinely most happy in their life. And I think that's what I mean when I talk about authenticity. It's about being able to, embrace all of you, the imperfections, the flaws, the brokenness, the mistakes, the greatness, the success, all of that there, being able to, allow all of it to be and not apologize for it. I think for me, that's what authenticity is.